By far, one of the most common questions I get is, how do I determine when a photo I'm going to put out there is in color or is in black and white? Let me just start off by saying that I'm typically like 70% color, 30% black and white. I'm not like a 50-50, and I'm definitely not more into black and white than color. But there is a little bit of reasoning and logic that I have that goes into my decisions of when I'm looking at a photo, will this photo be color or will it be black and white? And no matter what I'm going to choose, when I'm actually shooting and I'm using the back of my screen to review images or anything like that, I'm always monitoring in black and white. I set my cameras up so the screen is always in black and white, even if I fully intend to present color images. Today I want to show you my process of how I determine when a photo is going to be in color or when a photo is going to be in black and white. And it all comes down to one simple question. I always ask myself, what is more interesting in this composition? Is it the color or the contrast? I will also ask myself, what is more appropriate for this photo? Is it simplicity or is it complexity? Personally, I find black and white to be a little more minimal, a little more simplistic, a little more isolating. And at the same time, I find color to be a little more rich, a little more complex, and a little more robust, especially with edit styles and how much you can manipulate a photo that is in color. Both of these scenarios allow you to do something pretty special as a photographer. It allows you to present an alternate reality. So like when you're editing a black and white photo, we do not see the world in black and white. And so there's almost like an interest in black and white because it doesn't require us to capture reality fully as it is the way an editorial photographer or a journalist would go capture. No, we can capture the moment, but it's different than how we experience the moment because it lacks color. In the same way, whenever we edit our color photos, we are also creating an alternate reality where maybe greens don't look as vibrant, maybe they're more of a yellow or muted color, or the sky is more teal rather than like a dark blue, or skin is more red, or you know what I mean? Like we manipulate reality when we edit our color photos to present our version of reality and what we would prefer to see in reality. But both lanes, whether it's black and white or color, are creating alternate realities for us. What I would like to do now is take a look at some of the images that were in one of my more recent videos where I traveled the Olympic Peninsula. You can look at that video right above if you haven't seen it yet. We're going to jump into the photos that I selected either for that video or in my online gallery, which is linked below. Some of these are black and white, and I want to share with you why I chose black and white and why I chose color. So let's dive in and let's take a look. So as you see here, we are on the PNW gallery, and let's take a photo like this one. Now this photo was taken at La Push, and it was a sunset photo. You've got some orange happening, but I don't show the sunset, but it's happening on the left side of the image. There's a lot of like haze in the air. The sky's blue. I mean, it's a really cool moment. Something like this cannot be translated in black and white to really capture the moment. The color is more interesting than the contrast. If you look here, really, the contrast is pretty minimal. You've got a dark beach and you've got the dark sea stacks, but everything else is basically bright. There is a lack of contrast spectrum happening in this image. The colors win. The colors are more interesting than the contrast, so this photo remains color. Now in that same vein, let's take a look at this one that I took of these ferns in one of the hikes I was on. Let's look at it without the black and white edit. And it is a great, cool spectrum of color as well. But if you look here, you've got sunlight coming through the forest and hitting the ferns, and you've got shadows and light. To me, the shadows and light at play here are more interesting than the green of the ferns and the brown of the floor. So I make this image black and white so that the contrast gets elevated and you're noticing now the sunlight and the shadows, and you're not really noticing the color or lack thereof. You can imagine what color this is. You see this and you instinctively know this is probably green, but it's really irrelevant because what I want you to see is not the green. What I want you to notice is the light coming through the forest, hitting this fern, and creating this scape of light and shadows. I find the contrast to be much more interesting, therefore I make this photo black and white. Let's take a look at this one because this is one that may have been able to go either way. What's happening here is this is a midday photo from Hurricane Ridge, and you've got the tree in the front in the foreground, you've got the rolling mountainside behind it, a forest, and in the background you've got a very blue, hazy sky, and it creates this really deep photo with an interesting color gradient. And what I want you to see here is if we look at the top of the photo to the tree line, there's like a spectrum of blue that is darkening into the tree line. And then from the bottom of the photo going up, you've got a spectrum of yellows and greens that are kind of rolling up and meeting this green in the middle. I personally find the color spectrum from the top to the bottom, bringing the photo in, pretty interesting. Now, if I was to make this a black and white photo, and let's put on Jupiter Mono, if I just hover this here, the contrast really is not as interesting as the color gradient and spectrum that is in the color version of this photo. Now, it's cool to see the contrast in the tree and the lack of contrast from the back mountain and to the sky, but honestly, the color is just way more interesting. So color wins, and this photo remains a color photo. But if I go over to this one, which I chose to be black and white, I found this photo to be really interesting in contrast, but not interesting at all in color. If you look here, that there's a lot of contrast happening. You've got these light rays coming through the clouds. You've got a very dark and stormy landscape rolling in, and it's darkening the hills and the trees. And it's not an interesting photo, in my opinion, regarding color. The blue haze and the gray clouds and this dark landscape is nowhere near as interesting as those light rays and as the dark mountains and trees and landscape would be against these bright clouds and the sun coming through. So that's why I put a black and white preset on here to overemphasize how dark the landscape is and how bright the sun rays are. And to me, this makes a much more interesting photo because contrast is more interesting than color in this particular photo. So let's take a photo like this, which is of the rocks and some plants and the water moving across them. So if I look at this as I shot it, as a color photo, I think it's pretty boring. The green, the blues off of the sky in the water, I just don't really find it as interesting. In fact, that reflection on the water, now again, I wasn't shooting with a polarizer or anything, but that reflection on the water to me hurts this photo. Now maybe if I would have shot it with a polarizer, I'd feel differently. But when I make this black and white, you don't really notice that reflection anymore. Instead, you see the contrast that is happening in the water, the top a little bright and shimmering, and the shadows of the rocks get a little deeper and darker. In black and white, the contrast is interesting, but the colors are not. They're just not as interesting. They look very plain and very basic, but when I make it black and white, it feels like a nice image. There are also a few exceptions to this rule that I have, because if I take a photo like this, which I made color, but it's a high contrast photo, I could have easily justified making this black and white. Let's take a look at how it would look with Jupiter Mono. I mean, it is an interesting looking photo in black and white, but because it was such a gloomy morning, but the sun was poking through and making these trees incredibly bright, surrounded by dark shadowed trees, I found the color spectrum in here to be more interesting than the contrast. Even though it's a high contrast photo, even though contrast is really winning this photo, the color version communicates more interest to me, so I made this edit a color photo. In that same vein, here is a photo that actually lacks a lot of contrast. There was no intense light. Let's take a look at the original. There really was no light. It was just a foggy road, completely shadowed forest, and a bright, overly bright sky above that was hazy and cloudy. This photo doesn't have interesting contrast really, unless you consider the darkness of the forest and road against the sky to be your contrast point, which that can happen. You know, you've got a very bright sky and a very dark subject. As I push this in color, I noticed that I kind of lost the eeriness of the fog. And so by making it black and white, the fog actually really pops out more. I'm drawn more to the fog, and I see more of the fog in black and white than I do with color. Sometimes it's good to try both and just see which one hits you more. Like, do you want to look at this photo and be drawn to the blues of the fog, or would you rather just know that there is fog, which is kind of what I did here. I just want to know there is fog, and black and white really helped communicate that. Okay, so one more photo, kind of a bonus approach, is whenever I'm doing portraits, this can really be a toss-up because I've got this photo of my friend Tim. We were in Yosemite last week. This photo could go either way. There's interest in the light because it was sunset. There's interesting colors around. Tim's outfit pops him off of the background. However, photos that are portraits can really go any way you want. You don't have to necessarily follow the rule of, is the color more interesting or is the contrast more interesting? You can isolate your subject typically easier in black and white than you can with color, which is why a lot of portraits look really nice in black and white, especially if you use some creative masking. Like, I'll just take a minute and mask Tim in the middle here. I'm gonna invert this mask and then just kind of pull the sides down a little bit to keep his face bright. The black and white really helps isolate him in the middle of this photo rather than focusing on all the other interesting things that are happening in this photo. And if I wanted to draw attention to things like the sunset or like the epic background, then I might make this photo color. Minimalism can be great with portraits, and even when the background is interesting, by making it black and white, you're actually minimizing the background and letting your subject pop a little more. So when it comes to portraits, it can really be cool to do black and white, maybe even more than color, but it's really up to you, the artist. I mix them up when I'm doing portraits and really mix them up just artistically, not following necessarily any set of rules. So what it comes down to for me personally is making the distinction of what is more interesting. Is it the color spectrum in this photo or the contrast of this photo? If I feel like the contrast is king, that image is going black and white, with a few exceptions. If I feel like color is king, then it's going to be a color photo with a few exceptions. Obviously, there's flexibility to everything that I'm saying. Because art is not a bunch of hard and fast rules. Art is art. And ultimately, you get to decide what your art looks like. But for me, this is the way I approach it, and I hope this video has been helpful for you as well in determining when you shoot a gallery of images, do you want to make it color? Do you want to make it black and white? If you have a process that's different, or maybe you have a similar mindset, leave a comment below and let's start a conversation in the comments about how we approach color in black and white. I'd love to hear your thoughts and see your process as well. As always, I appreciate you guys. Thanks for watching, and I will see you guys next time.